At what point do you emphasise the need for intelligence, and at what point do you emphasise the need for convictions?
What do you think the main points of your book are so far, if you could summarise?
So at the very heart of the book is the tension between prosecuting people or collecting intelligence. So I call that intelligence versus the law, and they're not mutually exclusive. That's a somewhat false setup, but it's what people tend to think. So essentially it's about informers working within terrorist organisations. So the people handling those informers know they're committing offences, but if you charge them, prosecute them, convict them and put them in prison, they don't have access to that intelligence anymore. At what point do you emphasise the need for intelligence, and at what point do you emphasise the need for convictions? But I started and completed my PhD at Trinity College in Dublin. I hadn't studied in Ireland before, or Northern Ireland, and obviously there's a lot of interest in contemporary Irish history at Trinity College in Dublin, and that's what got me into the Northern Ireland aspect of all of these issues.
So you've been working over this for like the past 10 years. Working on any project for that long is quite a task in itself. Can you talk a bit about your own research and writing process through that, and kind of what the timeline has been like for you?
Mm-hmm. So despite intelligence being a classified subject, broadly speaking, there have been so many investigations into these allegations of collusion and other allegations connected to informers during the Troubles that those inquiries have made a lot of information public. The most well-known ones are Agent Stakeknife. We're still awaiting the final report of the investigation into Agent Stakeknife's activities. He was involved in the IRA, where his role was actually to find people who were informers within the IRA and to execute them. I've looked at as many case studies as I could find and as much information as I could find about what decisions were made and have been made since the beginning of the Troubles in the late 60s up to today about whether to prosecute informers and when to prosecute them. Instances where, with Brian Nelson, for example, a well-known informer who was arrested and charged and convicted of, I think, 10 counts of murder in the 90s. There is a document from the Defence Secretary at the time listing a long list of reasons why he did not want Brian Nelson to be prosecuted. One of which would be that prosecuting an informer would deter other people from coming forward as informers, because they would think, well, we're not going to get the protection that we would want in exchange from providing that intelligence at our own personal risk.
The Serious Organised Crime and Police Act 2005 suggests a reduction in sentence if the defendant has provided assistance to law enforcement. How does your book address this current legislation, and are the current laws adequate in explaining this?
There are two pieces of legislation that are particularly relevant. The Serious Organised Crime and Police Act allows for people who are no longer informing but instead providing evidence to get themselves a reduced sentence in exchange for that evidence that helps convict other people they used to work with in those violent terrorist groups. So that's an illustration of the point where they're not providing intelligence anymore, but they can still support the rule of law and justice by providing evidence in exchange for that reduced sentence. The other piece of legislation that's particularly relevant here is the 2021, what's called the Covert Human Intelligence Sources, which is Informers Criminal Conduct Act. That means that it's the first time that legislation in the UK has acknowledged that informers do commit offences in the line of collecting intelligence, and it takes that into account. I think it's a law that will be challenged in the courts, because it provided that the procedures it sets out are followed, then informers are immune from prosecution for any offences, including murder. So the law no longer applies equally to everyone. So informers remain something that's used very widely throughout the UK by the police in particular, for all sorts of reasons, but they're used for all sorts of organisations. So for example, the Food Standards Agency can use informers to help figure out what's going on with organised crime, who are illegally shipping in food that isn't what it should be, that shouldn't be getting into the UK, or that's mislabelled for their financial profit. So there's a really wide use of informers still today. I conducted interviews with people who've worked in intelligence. Obviously, they're particularly careful about what they can say and aware of risks to themselves of speaking up. So most of them spoke under anonymity, which obviously has to be taken very seriously. There's a particular report that talks about an informer in anonymous terms, but gives away so much information about what they did over a number of years and what offences they were involved in, that it is widely known what his real identity was. So I didn't want to put that identity in the book because I don't think it should be out there, but at the same time it is already out there. So it was a difficult balance to work out, you know, how do I tell the reader that I do know these things and that I haven't missed this in the research process, but without directly putting somebody in danger of being identified as an informer.
Why is this so kind of relevant and important to readership in 2024? What do you think is something kind of new that we can acquire from your research that you've done so far?
The topic is so important today because there are still so many court cases, public inquiries and other investigations that are still going on. That shows how important it is and how much bereaved families and survivors are still pushing for either for justice or for truth-finding investigations. Just in September of this year, a new public inquiry was announced into the murder of Patrick Finucane in 1989. There was an informer involved in his murder, which is arguably why the British government has said no to a public inquiry until now. It was the change from the Conservative government to the Labour government that was very quickly followed by the new government announcing a public inquiry. And Finucane's family have been at the High Court, the Supreme Court, the European Court of Human Rights for more than 20 years pushing for a full investigation. So that just shows how strong feelings are and how they still persist. And I think they will persist until all of the investigations are completed.
I guess now that it's done, how do you feel?
I'm relieved. I'm really happy that it's out. I'm really happy that people are going to be able to read it at last. And I'm going to be putting my work in the new year into making sure that I shout about it loudly and publicise it to all the people who I think can benefit from understanding the issues that I've examined in the book.
So are there any kind of future projects that you've got in the works or anything that you'd like to be working on after finishing this?
One of my major objectives is to spread the word about this work now that it's done, now it's out there and people can read it. I've got two smaller projects, journal article projects that I'm finishing off. One's about private military companies, which I'm doing with a former student actually who did excellent research on that. I'm also starting some research on different forms of investigations, like from murder investigations to public inquiries and the police ombudsman's office. There's all sorts of different forms of investigations into these kinds of allegations connected with terrorist informers. Some of them people widely accept and say, yeah, I'm really happy with that investigation. Others, the report comes out and the bereaved families say, no, I don't like that at all. So my question to myself for my research is, what makes a good investigation? What makes an effective one and one that's actually going to be accepted by the people it's there to serve?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was awesome.
Good.
That was great. I'm really happy with that.